we're going to go through the top 5 defensive players in the NFL in the 90s and the top 5 defensive players in the NHL, the MLB, and the NBA, and we're going to try to compare each sport and each defensive player in the next half an hour. So, Speedy, your top 5 defensive players in the NFL in the 90s.
It's a lot of the guys you mentioned. I think Deion Sanders and Ronnie Lott were definitely the 2 best at their positions, corner and safety. 2 pass rushers, I think, are definitely on the list are Reggie White, who was second all-time in career sacks, with 199, did it with 2 different teams and was great for both of them. And Bruce Smith, who's an all-time leader with 200 sacks. I think both those guys have to be on there when you look at it. I think White was a better run stopper, but I think in terms of both of them being on there, they're both fantastic. And then Charles Haley too, right beyond that. I think those would be the 5 for me. Ray Lewis, I think, is right on the end of the decade, so he would be more of the 2000s mold for that. And in terms of middle linebackers, I don't know if there were any to stand out that would be that much better than a lot of the guys we listed here. So those are my top 5.
All right, so I'll let you pick the top 5 of the NFL. Now I'm going to pick the top 5 of the NBA. And it's a good question because Tim Duncan came at the tail end of the 90s, so we can't really add Tim Duncan to that list. Michael Jordan, one of the greatest defensive players at his position, at the shooting guard position. I would say Michael Jordan would be my number 1 guy. My number 2 guy, and you could put Scottie Pippen there too, because to me, he was the best all-around defensive player that could play every single position in a game. So I would put Scottie Pippen there. Magic Johnson would be another guy that I would put there on that list, who was a top defensive player of the 90s. And I know everybody says, well, Magic Johnson didn't really play throughout the 90s, but Magic Johnson dominated not only 1 or 2 or 3 positions, he defended all 5 positions. So Magic Johnson is a guy that I would definitely look at in that category as well. David Robinson is another guy that I would put there. This guy was a dominant force at the center position defensively. That's why they called him the Admiral. Very, very talented, great defensive player in the 90s. And really, to the end of the 90s to the 2000 era where Tim Duncan took over for him. And at number 5, you know, a lot of people don't give this guy a lot of respect in the 90s in basketball. And maybe because he was and I know a lot of people are going to put Dennis Rodman because Dennis Rodman is on the list. As a matter of fact, I will put Dennis Rodman on that list as well. So my number 6 guy, I'll give him my number 6 guy because a lot of people don't give this guy credit. And that's Bill Laimbeer, who was a very, very good defensive player for those Detroit Piston teams, really in the late 80s, early 90s. He was a big driving force of that defense, especially how good that defense was with Dennis Rodman, with Bill Laimbeer and Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars. I mean, that was a great defensive team, great all-around defensive team. So I would say those were my top 5, top 6, if you really want to put them. Now, as far as hockey, where do you go with hockey, Speedy?
Well, hockey, it's interesting because I think the hockey ones are kind of obvious with defense. Now, I think one that isn't as great as an offensive player as he was a defensive player was Scott Stevens. I think that's one of the obvious ones you could look at. Physical guy, one of the first, obviously the best one of that trap defense for the Devils. And I think in terms of a physical element of hockey, that's something that I think has been lost in today's game a little more. I mean, there's still some teams that do it, but I think Scott Stevens is one for sure. Chris Chelios, another one, a physical guy. He played a long time in the NHL. What did he play, 21 or 22 seasons? Mm-hmm. He played for a very long time, both with the Blackhawks and the Red Wings, and he was another guy in that physical mold as well. And then you got the obvious, the Nicholas Lidströms, the Ray Borks, who were both fantastic at that time. And Ray Bork has also the offensive numbers to go with his defense as well. Both phenomenal guys in that right as well. So I think for hockey, I think those are really, it's not really as much lesser known guys as it is more of those obvious guys that are really, they stood out in that decade the most.
As far as I'm concerned, in baseball, Ivan Rodriguez was the best defensive player, best defensive catcher in baseball in the 90s with the Texas Rangers. And as he moved around, when going to the Marlins, he was a dominant force defensively. Ken Griffey Jr., one of the greatest outfielders of our era, really. Ken Griffey Jr., I think 14 or 13 Gold Gloves. Dominant cement in center field. Also, Barry Bonds was a great defensive player with Pittsburgh. I know everybody says, well, in San Francisco, he really wasn't the same player. but he was a fantastic defensive player. Cal Ripken Jr. was a great shortstop, defensive player. That was his strength, really, at the defensive position. And the reason why we're talking about 90s is because we were talking about Michael Jordan and The Last Dance. And Michael Jordan, really, if you watch the 90s basketball or 90s baseball or football, it was a defensive sport. They were defensive sports.
Until the steroid era.
And then it started transitioning into the offensive game. And I understand that the leagues wanted to transition the games because it made the games more fun to watch, more interesting to watch. You see more home runs, more goals, more touchdowns. I understand all that. But it has transitioned it so much that it's ruined the game. It has ruined the game. When you look at football, for instance, guys, and I know there's a lot of football fans out there that love defense. And defense wins championships. Go up and down the NFL, even watching the last couple of Super Bowls, the better defensive team usually won those Super Bowls. So I think it's a dying position now. I really do. And you talk about guys like right now in the NFL, like Khalil Mack or Aaron Donald or Darrelle Revis of our time, or Gilbert, or any one of these guys that we've seen are starting to develop into great defensive players, or even players that are about at the end of their careers. They don't get enough credit at their positions because everybody wants that high-flying wide receiver, high-flying running back, high-flying throwing touch base running quarterback like Russell Wilson.
Right.
They're not looking at the defensive style of game and how important the defensive style of game is to the NFL or the NBA or the NHL or the MLB.
The other thing to look at with football, too, I think, is that there's a lot of defensive stats that are very deceiving. You could look at a safety, you could look at a corner and say, oh, this guy had 8 interceptions this year. Does that mean he's automatically the best corner in football? Not necessarily. It just means you're thrown at a lot. Same thing with tackles. You could be the league leader in tackles with 180 or something like that, like Barry Church was one year. Was Barry Church ever the best safety in football? No. So you have definitely instances like that. And then the other thing, too, is like you were saying, the defensive priorities in today's game, because it's such an offensive league, there's more top corners, which, again, the stats are not going to show that, but we know who they are. There's more, again, if you're not a pass rusher, you really are nothing in today's game. So it makes it a lot harder for that. And now we're seeing another shift. Versatile guys. Could that make a difference too?
How could it not hurt the sport when defense is a big part of the game and the sport? A great defense creates a good offense. But I think a lot of these owners and a lot of these GMs are starting to transition into the offensive style of game. And I think it ruins the game and the fun of the game, and really seeing the depth of the position on how these players grow in their positions. The cornerback position is a very intriguing, important position. But the safety position now is developing into a specific position that a lot of NFL GMs are looking at, filling that spot more than the corners because the corners are too expensive to pay. So I understand how the leagues have tried to transition or change, and I understand the whole growth of the sport and trying to generate the millennials to watch the sport and try to drive more people to watch the sport. But again, it ruins the game. It ruins the speed of the game. And I think with these different rules trying to benefit the offensive side of the ball or offensive side of the puck or the baseball, it's not helping. It's not generating more fans through that sport. So I do believe it's all about the popularity of the players in the league. It's really not about the rules. But I also believe that changing the game and changing the speed of the game because of the defensive style of the game is not going to help the game as a whole.
Right, and it's also lost some jobs, too. Think about physical body types versus speed body types now. Look at all the linebackers that were great in the 2000s and even in the late 90s, like Ray Lewis and Brian Urlacher, Lance Briggs, guys like that, Zach Thomas. Those are big, bulky, physical guys that were excellent run stoppers and good in physical coverage. But again, you don't see that anymore because you have a speed game. Same thing with the NBA. There's not a lot of good centers in the league now too because they really devalue the position. So you look at it like that too. Hockey, it's a good mixture. There's some good defensemen left from that still early 2000s, mid 2000s that are still
now,
decent, but
now
it's still
even
more smaller
now
speed
even the
defensemen.
defenseman is now these defensive players in the NHL are becoming more offensive style of players than they are defensive style players. How many defensive players, top defensive players in the NHL right now are dominant defenders more than they are offenders at their position? There are not many of them.
Right. It's really only a select few with guys like Petrangelo and Carlson, guys like that, but that's really it. When you look at the veteran guys, a lot of the guys are either one or the other, especially the young players now. There are some young players that are great defensively, but they're not as good offensively, or they're really good offensively and still kind of raw defensively too. So yeah, there's not many of them now. And especially with forwards, too. There's not a lot of good defensive forwards as much anymore either.
And even in basketball, when you watch the game of basketball, how many teams do you see actually play team defense? Not many of them. And how many teams have that one defender that can help out on the defensive side of the ball on 4 or 5 different positions? There are not many of them. So I think the game has transitioned and really changed. And I think that the league has to look at, and I'm talking about the NBA, the NHL, the MLB, and the NFL. They have to look at the defensive side of the ball, or the defensive side of the puck or the baseball, as much as they look at the offensive style of a game, because defense always wins championships. Go back. Go look at the Washington Nationals. Pitching is a style of defense. It is a defensive side of the game. Now, if you don't have a top pitching staff, are you going to win a championship? Probably not.
If you don't have that, you're going to have a top position player defense as well. We saw that with the Royals. They had a good bullpen, but their starting rotation wasn't anything special. And they had a top position player defense, historically good in terms of the infield. I think infield statistics in particular, they were historically good. And then the Cubs the year after, they had some good pitchers, but it was more, they still had that great infield defense. Baez, Rizzo, Russell, all fantastic defenders.
We have Jeff on the phone. What's going on, Jeff?
I realize the game is going to a more offensive style of game and everything like that. But how much of that is because, all the defensive players are getting locked up these days? DeAndre Baker and Ed Oliver and Cody Latimer. None of these guys are staying in the game anymore. They're all getting, DeAndre Baker went from being a lockdown corner to a locked up corner.
He was never a lockdown corner in the NFL. He was iffy his rookie year at best.
I'm just saying, all the defensive players are in jail now. So, of course it's an offensive league.
No, I knew you were going to call up and say something crazy, but I will say this.
How is that crazy?
No, but because DeAndre Baker, to me, I don't look at DeAndre Baker yet as a top defensive player. And I agree with you that Lattimore, in the story that you heard about Cody Lattimore pulling out his gun and shooting his gun at innocent people because of a card game, and then saying that his 4-year-old son was raped, and that's why he pulled out his gun. I mean, read these stories. These stories are crazy that's going on in the world. And these athletes.
I'm watching Oprah. You get a gun charge, and you get a gun charge, and you get a gun charge.
And you want to know something? Since this COVID-19 has been really taking over the world, and these players and these athletes are doing stupid things on and off the field and on and off the court, which has been absolutely degrading for the sport and the growth of the sport, because now you talk about some of the growth of some of these young players like DeAndre Baker, like this guy Lattimore, and you look at what they're doing on and off the field. Do you really want these guys a part of your team, even if they come out not guilty from these charges? I don't think I would want Lattimore to come back. I don't think I would want DeAndre Baker. Even if the stories are not true, I want nothing to do with these guys, a part of my team, my organization, and my multi-billion-dollar team.
Organization.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want them. I don't want them to be a part of my organization.
And there's one other thing. Speedy just said, unless you're a pass rusher on defense, you don't really matter in the league anymore. Is that what you said, Speedy?
I said they don't prioritize it as much. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm saying the teams are not going to prioritize it as much to give a good nose tackle money or give a good physical, not as fast middle linebacker or something like that money.
I'm gonna use my team as an example here. How many good pass rushes did the Patriots have last year?
One, really. That was it.
Right. And who was the defensive player of the year in the league last year?
Stephon Gilmore. But we never downgraded the corners.
Not a pass rusher.
Right. We never downgraded the corners. We said they were the only exception to that rule, really.
Not a pass rusher. and on a team with not much of a pass rush whatsoever. Corners are the future. That's why